Can you believe that an entire empire, built on poetry, silk, and whispered gossip, was completely and utterly demolished by men who only knew the language of blood? This is not just a story of swords. This is the chilling, impossible saga of how a handful of provincial guards, dirty, barbaric, and utterly unstoppable, crashed the gates of civilization and redefined the very soul of a nation, giving birth to the legend of the samurai. A catastrophe no one saw coming, yet it had been brewing in the shadows of Japan for 400 years, a slow-motion earthquake waiting for the perfect moment to shatter the world. Before the samurai were the iconic figures of honor and death, they were simply the ghosts haunting the periphery of power. Imagine Japan in the 9th century, a world centered entirely on Heian, the city of peace, a jewel box of culture and unbearable decadence. The emperor ruled technically, but true power was held by the Fujiwara clan, a dynasty of court nobles so refined, so focused on composing perfect 31-syllable poems and wearing impossibly layered kimonos, that they forgot the world outside their perfect walled garden even existed. They had outsourced the messy, unpleasant business of actual governing and, crucially, defending their vast estates to distant, unrefined provincial managers, men whose hands smelled of leather, sweat, and iron, not expensive incense. These managers were the early samurai, the saburao, those who serve, and their service quickly transformed into brutal autonomy. While the nobles in Heian argued over the proper angle of a fan or the shade of purple for a funeral ribbon, the warriors in the provinces were fighting for their lives against bandits, rebels, and, increasingly, against each other. The court dismissed them as vulgar security guards, little more than glorified thugs with sharp objects. They were, tragically, catastrophically wrong. As the central government weakened, paralyzed by generations of incestuous political maneuvering and economic collapse stemming from massive tax exemptions granted to religious orders and powerful clans, the provincial samurai grew wealthy, organized, and terrifyingly independent. They began forming their own private armies, huge militias bonded by personal fealty, creating power blocks that operated entirely outside the flimsy jurisdiction of the capital. The great clans of the Minamoto and the Taira, names that would soon be whispered in terrified prayers across the archipelago, started their slow march towards absolute dominion, consolidating control over vast swaths of land. This was the terrifying pivot point, the moment when the sword became mightier than the poem. The court nobles, soft from centuries of peace and comfort, could not fathom the brutal reality these warriors faced daily. They believed their ancient titles and spiritual authority were sufficient protection. They believed the universe itself would prevent the common man from overturning divine mandate. But the samurai did not care about divine mandate. They cared about land, power, and the terrifying, beautiful curve of a freshly forged katana. These were not mere riots. These were the first times that the great warrior clans, Minamoto and Taira, brought their fully armed, battle-hardened forces directly into the hallowed streets of Heian itself. The stench of blood and burning wood overwhelmed the delicate aroma of the court's perfumes. The shock was absolute. Imagine the scene. a Fujiwara noble, meticulously dressed, attempting to discuss an ancient scroll, only to be interrupted by the guttural screams of men being hacked apart just yards away, the clang of steel echoing off the silk tapestries. Kiyomori was the ultimate embodiment of the rising samurai spirit, brutal, ambitious, yet briefly seduced by the courtly life he had conquered. He forced his daughter into the imperial line, attempting to merge the world of the sword with the world of the silk. But this hybrid could not hold. The old families hated him for his vulgarity. The warriors hated him for his attempts at elegance. This instability ensured the coming storm would be generational and cleansing. The stage was set for the greatest, most devastating civil war in Japanese history, the war that would confirm the samurai's reign for 7 centuries, a war driven not by political ideology, but by deep, primal hatred between 2 colossal warrior families, the Minamoto and the Taira. This is where the true legend begins, a legend forged in the burning ruins of the old world, demanding total loyalty and the ultimate sacrifice, the Bushido way. While the warrior class was sharpening their blood-forged blades in the harsh, unforgiving eastern lands, the imperial court in Heian was utterly perfecting the art of the 12-layered silk kimono and composing exquisite 31-syllable poems about the fleeting, heartbreaking beauty of a morning dewdrop. They were sheltered, utterly blind, living in a fragrant bubble of exquisite calligraphy and courtly intrigue, where their greatest fear was a badly composed haiku, not the glint of steel reflecting the sun of a hostile province. The emperor himself was a beautiful ghost, a divine puppet, hidden behind screens of sandalwood and power centralized in the hands of the all-powerful Fujiwara regents, who honestly believed that inherent status was armor enough against reality. They ignored the chilling truth that the very foundation of their power was rotting beneath them, dissolving into the rice fields and mountains that lay beyond their manicured gardens. They were the center of the universe, yet their influence barely extended past the city walls, existing in a magnificent gilded cage, while the true lords of the future were being forged in fire and absolute necessity. This fracturing was driven by the system itself. The massive, tax-exempt land estates known as shogun were becoming private kingdoms, effectively starving the imperial treasury and draining Kyoto's military capacity until it was nothing but a ceremonial mockery. Local administrators, often minor nobles exiled to the uncivilized frontier, became warlords overnight, realizing with a terrifying clarity that authority wasn't granted by the emperor, it was brutally taken by force and held through unwavering intimidation. These new provincial landlords, desperate to protect their burgeoning wealth from bandits, tax collectors, and rival lords, needed pure, unadulterated muscle. They needed men who didn't care about the delicate nuances of court music or the subtle ranking of robes, but only about discipline, pain, and the savage, absolute willingness to kill and die without hesitation or question. This is precisely how the Saburo, the retainers, the men who served, the original samurai, first earned their chilling reputation, not as elegant heroes, but as necessary thugs and bodyguards, brought into the capital by terrified nobles who couldn't trust the effeminate, weak palace guards to keep them alive for a single night. Imagine the sheer visceral shock. Rough, unwashed men smelling powerfully of horse sweat, leather, and blood, standing silent guard, while perfumed courtiers whispered and plotted behind colorful fans, their very presence a stain on the refined culture. They were seen as the required evil, the dark poison needed to fight the pestilence of rural lawlessness and uprising. The courtiers tolerated them, laughed at their rough provincial accents, and then, slowly, agonizingly, started depending on them for the most basic element of survival, giving them a frightening foothold. This profound dependence was the first deep-seated nail driven into the coffin of the entire Heian establishment, a catastrophic concession of power the court could never truly recover. From the shadows of these rising provincial armies, two names began to echo across the countryside with increasing volume and terror. Two families descended from minor, forgotten imperial lines who embraced the warrior life entirely and brutally. The Taira, often called the Heike, and the Minamoto, forever known as the Genji. They moved far beyond mere protection. They were actively building highly organized, devastating armies, perfecting the unique art of mounted archery, which transformed the battlefield into a lethal, terrifying ballet of speed, precision, and overwhelming striking power. The Taira clan, often staying geographically closer to the court initially, sometimes served as governors and even protected the emperor's person, which gave them immense, fleeting prestige and access to state resources, but perhaps also dangerously softened their purely military edge. The Minamoto, conversely, were usually relegated to the harsher, wilder eastern provinces, where they became known for their relentless ferocity, their stubborn independence, and their unbreakable, iron loyalty to their regional, self-made power base, far from the debilitating soft influence of Kyoto. The true, unavoidable horror began when these two great warrior houses stopped fighting bandits and minor skirmishes and started fighting each other for the ultimate absolute control over the last vestiges of imperial authority and land ownership. The first tremors of this colossal, coming earthquake were deceptively subtle. A minor land dispute here, an intentional public slight during a court procession there. The rivalry simmered like lava beneath the surface of the capital. But the undercurrent was absolute and unyielding. Whoever controlled the sword controlled the entire destiny of Japan. The Heian nobles, wrapped up in their beautiful ignorance, watched these brutal, escalating skirmishes with detached aesthetic horror, like watching savage dogs fight in the distance, until the dogs abruptly turned their savage, terrifying eyes toward the audience itself. They had committed the fatal error. They had invited the wolf into the sheep pen, believing with utter arrogance that they could somehow control its leash, its hunger, and its terrifying instinctual power. These ruthless warriors, once simply hired hands and rough security, had now tasted the intoxicating essence of true, undeniable power. They were disciplined, they were unified by a shared experience of hardship and the absolute code, and they were utterly, chillingly ruthless, contrasting so sharply with the fragmented, gossiping, and fundamentally weak structure of the imperial administration, which was crumbling under its own weight. Every time a Minamoto rider charged or a Taira general asserted his authority over a terrified governor, the refined world of silks, perfumes, and poetry was violently chipped away piece by delicate piece, until nothing remained but the crude, hard structure of military might. The age of the aesthetic, the age of delicate artificial peace, was ending not with the gentle whisper of a poem, but with the deafening final clang of forged steel on steel. The spectral ghost of the warrior was no longer waiting in the distant provinces. It was standing right beside the emperor's throne, waiting for the command, or simply seizing the opportunity, to strike the fatal final blow. The time for courtly games and poetic rivalries was absolutely over. The time for the samurai had arrived, and their arrival brought the bloodiest civil war Japan had ever known. The bloodiest civil war Japan had ever known was not just a political clash. It was an existential earthquake that shook the foundations of the gilded capital. Kyoto, the city of peace, suddenly felt the icy grip of the provinces, a force so brutal and uncompromising it defied everything the sophisticated courtiers stood for. The Fujiwara regents, secure in their 1,000 years of tradition and their silken robes, had absolutely no idea the tidal wave of violence heading for them. They had invited the warrior wolf to guard their sheep, and now that wolf was ready to devour the entire flock. Two great warrior houses, both claiming descent from the imperial line, yet forged in the harsh reality of the eastern wilds, now stood ready to tear the country apart. On one side, the Taira clan, the Heike, led by the brilliant, ruthlessly ambitious Taira no Kiyomori. They were the rising stars, already established, slightly more refined, and held a crucial, tantalizing influence within the capital's fringes. They had tasted real power and found it intoxicatingly delicious. And against them, the Minamoto clan, the Genji, fierce, rugged, and deeply resentful of the Taira's sudden, soaring success. This was not mere competition. This was a rivalry born of ancient grudges and fueled by the ultimate prize: total military control over the imperial apparatus itself. The slightest tremor of instability was all it took. The stage was set for the Hogan Rebellion of 1156, a conflict that forever shattered the illusion of civilian control and brought the provinces screaming into the palace gates. Go Shirakawa called upon the two great rising generals, Taira no Kiyomori and Minamoto no Yoshitomo, forcing the two bitter rivals to fight temporarily together against the opposing forces which were led by a different, older branch of the Minamoto. The fighting erupted in the capital itself, a sacrilege. For the first time in centuries, heavily armored warriors were storming the grand estates and government buildings, treating the city of peace like a foreign conquest. Kiyomori, demonstrating a tactical genius that would define his era, convinced the emperor's side to launch a terrifying, unprecedented night attack. Imagine the horror: armored men screaming war cries that echoed off the elegant villas, setting fire to the homes of the aristocracy under the moonless sky. This was not the elegant, distant archery contests of the past. This was brutal, close quarters, unforgiving slaughter, a lesson delivered in fire and blood. The era of dignified banishment to remote provinces was absolutely over. The era of public beheadings had brutally begun. The samurai had tasted blood in the capital, and they discovered they deeply liked the flavor. But the uneasy alliance between the Taira and the Minamoto was a complete fiction, a temporary truce held together only by the necessity of defeating a common foe. Almost immediately, the two victorious generals turned their lethal focus upon each other. Minamoto no Yoshitomo felt deeply betrayed. He believed his contributions to the Hogan victory were deliberately undervalued compared to Kiyomori's sudden, soaring prestige and court appointments. Kiyomori was rapidly becoming the true, undisputed military power behind the chrysanthemum throne, a position Yoshitomo desperately coveted. Yoshitomo, reckless, deeply envious, and desperate, saw his perilous chance when Taira no Kiyomori left the capital on a pilgrimage. He launched a daring, brazen coup, kidnapping both the retired emperor Go Shirakawa and the reigning emperor Nijo. This was the Heiji Rebellion of 1160, a furious, short-lived spasm of ultimate violence played out in the dead of winter. The Minamoto were trying, in one desperate, bloody move, to reclaim the power they felt had been stolen from them by Taira maneuvering. Kiyomori believed he had successfully clipped their wings and permanently defanged the Minamoto threat. He thought he was being merciful, demonstrating his supreme confidence in authority. But in reality, he had only planted seeds of lethal, generational vengeance in the rough, fertile earth of the provinces. For the next 2 long decades, Taira no Kiyomori reigned supreme, bathing in the glory and decadent ease of the Heian court, while those 3 young, hardened boys grew up far away, dreaming only of the day they could return and burn the Taira name from the history books forever. Their time was coming, slowly, inevitably, and the cataclysm known as the Genpei War was now an absolute certainty. The stench of their arrogance became the very atmosphere of Kyoto. Every silk garment, every carefully composed poem, every extravagant banquet held within the walls of the capital was paid for with the sweat, blood, and dignity of the provincial warriors and landowners they now ruthlessly oppressed. But the divine right they mocked, the sacred bloodline they had reduced to a political plaything, had one voice left, small and desperate, hidden deep within the labyrinthine corridors of the court: Prince Mochihito. A son of the former Emperor Go-Shirakawa, he was deemed politically irrelevant, but he was not yet silenced. He was not meant for the throne, but he was meant for vengeance, and he knew that the moment for silent suffering had passed. In a move of staggering, suicidal defiance in 1180, he issued a secret, thunderous call to arms, a desperate summons carried by messengers who risked instant, horrific execution if caught by the omnipresent, paranoid Taira patrols. This was the signal that shattered the decade of fragile, enforced peace. It was not a political petition. It was the declaration of a blood feud that would consume the nation. This proclamation landed like a massive, burning spark in the dried tinder of the exiled Minamoto strongholds, igniting the rage that had been banked for 20 years since their crushing defeat. For 2 decades, the scattered remnants of the Minamoto had been waiting, hiding in the deep forests and rugged mountains of the Kanto region, forced to live among the very provincial warriors that Kiyomori had once dismissed as mere farmers with swords who served only his interests. They were no longer the refined courtiers of the capital. They were hardened survivors, forged in the rough heat of the provinces, nursed on the bitter milk of absolute revenge. And among them, waiting in his coastal exile at Izu, burning with a cold, calculated fury, was the man destined to become the true master of Japan, Minamoto no Yoritomo. When the Taira discovered Mochihito's plot and the subsequent flight of the prince, they moved with brutal swiftness, demanding Yoritomo's immediate surrender and summary execution, proving they understood the depth of the threat he represented, even in chains. Yoritomo knew there was no choice left but total war, a war that would end either with his head on a spike or the Taira dynasty in ashes. In the summer of 1180, Yoritomo raised his banner, the iconic white standard of the Minamoto, and unleashed the dogs of war. His first actions were clumsy, desperate, and nearly fatal, a searing testament to how close the Taira came to crushing the revolution before it even drew its first vengeful breath. At the Battle of Ishibashiyama, Yoritomo suffered a crushing defeat, his small initial force ambushed and scattered by Taira loyalists who were still numerous and efficient in their provincial domains. He was forced to flee through the treacherous mountains, hiding in the hollow of a massive camphor tree, nearly captured and executed by the relentless Taira pursuit. This was not the smooth, glorious uprising predicted in epic poems. It was a terrifying scramble for survival, proving that the Taira, though arrogant, still commanded immense military resources and deep loyalty in many key provinces. The revolutionary flame flickered dangerously close to extinction. Yet, Yoritomo possessed a genius for organization and alliance building that the Taira, focused entirely on the court, completely lacked. As he fled north into the relative safety of the massive Kanto plain, he began to weave a network of alliances, not through courtly favors, but through brutal, tangible promises of land and autonomous power. He spoke the single, compelling language of the warrior, loyalty repaid with spoils, discipline enforced by the absolute finality of the blade, and the intoxicating promise of total independence from the soft tyranny of Kyoto. This organization of disparate warrior bands, the Bushido, was the foundation of the first true shogunate structure, established years before he ever took the official title. He was organizing the chaos, building an army that served him, not the emperor. Meanwhile, in the gilded cage of Kyoto, Taira Kiyomori reacted to the news of Yoritomo's rebellion with predictable fury, yet catastrophic complacency. He viewed Yoritomo as a mere mosquito buzzing around his head, not a plague that would consume his entire family line. He ordered a massive counteroffensive, intending to snuff out the Kanto rebellion decisively and quickly. But the great Taira patriarch was failing. The years of ruthless power plays had taken their toll. He was suddenly ravaged by a fierce, consuming illness, perhaps a violent fever, that made his skin feel like fire and his breath taste of sulfur. He died tragically for his clan in 1181, leaving his family not with a secure, stable empire, but with a ticking time bomb and a rapidly mobilizing enemy. His final, horrifying and singular wish was whispered from his deathbed, a command that echoed the depth of his hatred. "Cut off the head of Yoritomo and hang it before my grave." But the man who could execute that terrible wish was gone. The Taira leadership that remained, especially his heir, Taira no Munemori, lacked Kiyomori's steel spine, his ruthless tactical genius, and his almost supernatural control over the warrior class. The vacuum created by Kiyomori's death was immediately and violently filled by the rising tide of Minamoto power. And this power was not centralized solely around Yoritomo. Two other terrifying, emerging figures, both Minamoto blood and both renowned for their sheer destructive military brilliance, now stepped into the light, ready to claim their share of the coming storm. Minamoto no Yoshinaka, the Kiso Avenger, and the legend whispered in shadows, Minamoto no Yoshitsune. The war had begun, and the world of the samurai was about to explode. The drums of war were not beating softly in the provinces. They were tearing the silk curtains of Kyoto apart, sound by violent sound. The Taira clan, basking in the suffocating warmth of the capital, initially dismissed the uprising as a spasm, a provincial tantrum they could swiftly crush with their vast reserves of land and men. They had controlled the emperor, they had tasted the sweet poison of court power, and they believed their polished armor was impenetrable, failing to understand that the true strength of the samurai was forged not in the perfumed halls of power, but in the desolate, unforgiving mud of the battlefield. Minamoto no Yoritomo, the exiled son, was not foolish enough to march straight at the heart of the beast. He was a master chess player, a cold calculator whose vengeance was served not hot, but perfectly frozen. While the Taira waited for him to make a dramatic, suicidal move, Yoritomo was securing the entire Kanto region, turning the rugged eastern provinces into an unshakable fortress, a staging ground for the final, devastating act. He was raising an army, but more importantly, he was raising a government, establishing Kamakura as the anti-Kyoto, a city built on the laws of the sword, not the rituals of the fan. A silent promise of a new era ruled entirely by martial might. But the first true explosion of the Genpei War did not come from Yoritomo's measured hand. It came howling down from the northern mountains, driven by the pure, unbridled fury of Minamoto no Yoshinaka. Known as the Kiso Avenger, Yoshinaka was not a courtier, nor was he a refined general. He was a creature of the wild, a mountain warrior whose men were as rough and ruthless as the terrain they commanded. He viewed the Taira not as political rivals, but as prey, and his advance was less a military campaign and more a force of nature, gathering speed and terror as it swept through central Japan, a tidal wave of provincial resentment finally unleashed. The Taira sent massive armies to quell this mountain bandit, confident that their disciplined, well-equipped forces would easily scatter the ragged provincial fighters. They were about to learn a terrible lesson about the difference between a samurai trained for parade and one trained for survival in the wilderness. For true power lay not in pedigree, but in lethal efficiency. Yoshinaka did not fight fairly, he fought brutally, relying on shock, psychological warfare, and an intimate knowledge of the rugged landscape that swallowed the city-dwelling Taira whole, turning the elegant battle formations of the capital into disorganized, muddy chaos. The clash culminated in 1183 AD at the treacherous Kurikara Pass. The Taira fielded a force estimated at 40,000 men, confident they had trapped the Kiso army in the narrow ravines of the deep mountains. They set up camp, arrogant in their numerical superiority, expecting to crush Yoshinaka at dawn. What they received was a nightmare painted in fire and blood, a lesson in terror delivered just as the sun dipped below the peaks. As twilight fell and the Taira forces settled into their positions, believing themselves safe until morning, Yoshinaka unleashed one of the most brilliant and barbaric maneuvers in Japanese military history, the infamous fire oxen attack. His men drove hundreds of oxen, their horns fitted with blazing, oil-soaked torches, hurtling down the steep, forested slopes directly into the main body of the Taira encampment. The effect was instantaneous and apocalyptic. The terrified animals, blinded by pain and flames, became living, rampaging weapons, plunging into the tents and scattering the Taira lines with maddening force. The Taira soldiers dissolved into screaming chaos. Men trampled, horses spooked, tents incinerated, formations shattered before the first Minamoto arrow was even loosed. The mountain warriors of Kiso then descended like predatory ghosts, howling their victory and mercilessly exploiting the utter pandemonium, pushing the disorganized enemy into the ravines below. The court aristocracy, who had spent decades perfecting poetry and arranging their layered silk robes, suddenly faced the inescapable reality of the samurai, a terrifying, unstoppable force that did not bow to imperial decree, but to the raw, visceral supremacy of its own blade. The Taira recognized their immediate fatal peril. Yoshinaka, the Kiso Avenger, was coming, and he was not known for his mercy or his appreciation of delicate haiku. He was coming for vengeance and for blood. In a desperate, humiliating exodus, the Taira clan packed up the 6-year-old emperor on Toku, and, crucially, the sacred imperial regalia, the mirror, the jewel, and the sword, the very symbols of Japan's divine legitimacy and eternal heritage, and fled the capital toward the Western Sea, abandoning the city they had ruled absolutely and decadently for 20 terrifying years. The capital was empty, stripped bare of its rulers and its divine protectors. When Yoshinaka finally marched into Kyoto, he did not enter as a savior of the emperor, but as a provincial menace, an occupying army of barbarians. His mountain men, unused to the delicate rules and strictures of the capital, looted, drank, and behaved with terrifying disregard for the sanctity of the imperial city, shocking the remaining refined nobles who had barely recovered from the Taira's sudden flight. Yoshinaka, powerful but politically clumsy, tried to rule but only succeeded in alienating the very court he sought to liberate and control. He was a force of pure destruction, incapable of constructive governance, lacking the political finesse necessary to manage the volatile center of Japan. This was Yoritomo's cue, the moment the true strategist realized the time had come to remove the unpolished pawn. Watching from the calculated, safe distance of Kamakura, Yoritomo saw not a great ally in Yoshinaka, but a dangerous, unpredictable rival who threatened the unified Minamoto claim to absolute power. The Kiso Avenger had served his brutal purpose by clearing the Taira from Kyoto, but now he had to be eliminated, and quickly, before he could truly solidify his reckless hold on the emperor and the capital. The stage was set for a civil war within the civil war, a brutal, fratricidal conflict that proved the samurai creed was always survival of the fittest, even among brothers. Yoritomo, ever the cold, calculating strategist, dispatched his 2 younger half-brothers, men who were destined to become the defining, bloody legends of the Genpei conflict, to clean up the mess and crush the man who had done the hardest initial fighting. He sent the disciplined, tactical general, Minamoto no Noriyori, a steady hand of command, and the lightning bolt of pure military prowess, the man whose legend would eclipse all others, Minamoto no Yoshitsune. The true samurai epic was just beginning, pitting brother against brother, and setting the stage for the most famous, devastating period of warfare Japan would ever know. The court watched, horrified, as the warriors began to cannibalize their own, knowing that the winner would inherit the blood-soaked ruins of their once beautiful, silk-wrapped world. The air over Kyoto did not smell of incense anymore. It reeked of iron and ambition. The Taira clan, known as the Heike, had won the first critical rounds of this deadly game, ruthlessly sweeping aside their rivals in the Hogan and Heiji rebellions, turning the once sacred capital into a theater of calculated executions. Their leader, the stone-cold, calculating Taira no Kiyomori, now stood on the neck of the imperial system, breathing down the back of every silk-clad noble, effectively holding the ancient throne hostage. Kiyomori didn't just win battles. He mastered the art of political infiltration, marrying his daughters into the imperial line, stuffing key court positions with his own hardened samurai retainers who looked utterly out of place in the decadent halls of power. He took the very playbook of the manipulative Fujiwara regents, the men who had ruled Japan through passive aggression for centuries, and refined it with one terrifying addition: the constant, chilling threat of instant, bloody decapitation if anyone dared whisper dissent. The capital was his playground, and the emperor was his golden puppet, draped in robes of state but utterly devoid of real authority. This wasn't merely a shift in authority. It was the ultimate contamination. The moment the warrior class realized they didn't need the ancient legitimacy of the court, they could simply annex it. Among those spared were two names that would soon be etched into the very foundation of samurai legend, names that would return like a scythe to harvest the Taira dynasty: Minamoto no Yoritomo and his younger half-brother, the ghost-like strategist Yoshitsune. Yoritomo was banished to the desolate eastern provinces, specifically the Izu Peninsula, a land of tough farmers, rugged terrain, and independent warrior bands who resented the soft, distant rule of Kyoto. This was Kiyomori's gravest error, a blunder that would cost him his lineage and his life. He sent the viper into the tall grass, believing it was merely a harmless worm, allowing it to grow fangs in the shadows far from his sight. While Kiyomori enjoyed the perfumed luxuries of Kyoto, accumulating vast wealth and demanding a deference that bordered on divine worship, Yoritomo was forging alliances in the shadows, hardening his resolve in the crucible of exile, observing the political map of Japan. The Taira themselves began to rot from the inside out. Power, unchallenged and easily won, becomes toxic to those who inherit it. Kiyomori's family and retainers became infamous for their greed and cruelty, seizing vast swaths of land, flaunting their wealth in garish displays, and treating the provincial warrior class they sprang from with utter contempt. They forgot the dirt, the rigorous training, the disciplined hardship that had brought them to the pinnacle of Japan's power structure. They became the very effete, careless aristocracy they had once scorned, focusing on poetry and court ranks while their grip on their own warriors began to loosen. This simmering resentment, fueled by Taira overreach, finally boiled over in 1180. A desperate call to arms was issued by Prince Mochihito, an imperial prince who had finally endured enough of Kiyomori's dictatorial rule, fearing not just for his position, but for the extinction of the imperial bloodline's dignity. This wasn't just a political maneuver, it was a desperate plea for the soul of Japan, a fiery manifesto smuggled out into the provinces, urging all those loyal to the true imperial line and hating the Taira to rise and avenge the old ways. This spark immediately ignited the long-awaited inferno, the Genpei War. The signal fire blazed across the Kanto, the eastern region where Yoritomo was exiled, and the banished Minamoto no Yoritomo immediately recognized his moment, stepping out of the shadows and seizing the prince's manifesto as his divine mandate to rule. He didn't rush immediately to the capital, the seat of corruption and distraction. Instead, he consolidated his power base in Kamakura, far away from the distractions of silk robes and poetry readings, establishing a fortress of military discipline. He systematically brought the rugged Kanto warrior clans under his strict, unwavering banner, promising them not just victory, but a genuine share in the new world order, a world built by the strength of their own swords. He established what would become the embryonic form of the shogunate, a military government, demanding absolute loyalty and discipline from his followers, promising stability and land in exchange for their unwavering fealty. This was the true birth of the warrior state, a structure designed to last 7 centuries, and it was engineered by a man still technically under imperial banishment. Kiyomori, arrogant until the end, initially dismissed Yoritomo's uprising as minor skirmishes, sending his armies east with the confidence of men who had never known true defeat against a major foe. But these were not the disorganized rebels of 20 years prior. These were hardened, desperate warriors following a brilliant, calculating commander. The first major Taira defeats shocked Kyoto to its core, revealing a vulnerability the warrior aristocracy thought they had buried forever. Then came the second, terrifying wave of Minamoto fury, led by Yoritomo's younger, wilder half-brother, Minamoto no Yoshitsune, the man who would become the paradigm of the reckless, brilliant battlefield commander. Where Yoritomo was the meticulous planner, the strategic architect, the political heavyweight, Yoshitsune was the pure whirlwind of battle, the military prodigy who lived for the impossible charge, the daring maneuver, the total annihilation of the enemy position. He was pure kinetic energy, a phantom general whose tactics were so unconventional, so brutally effective, they seemed pulled from folklore even while they were happening on the battlefield. He was the ultimate sword counterpart to Yoritomo's political shield, and together they formed the most devastating military partnership Japan had ever or would ever face. The Taira, accustomed to winning easily and living luxuriously, found themselves suddenly fighting for their lives, often against terrain they did not understand and enemies fueled by generational hatred. They were pushed out of the Kanto, back toward the center of Japan, their beautiful courtly lives collapsing like a house of cards under the relentless pressure of the Minamoto tide. Kiyomori, the architect of Taira dominance, died during the early years of the conflict in 1181, consumed not by a samurai sword, but by a horrific fever of rage and illness, reportedly cursing the Minamoto with his final venomous breath. His death was a massive psychological blow, stripping the Taira of their only true strategic mind. Now led by less capable, more panicked successors, the Taira became a desperate, fleeing army, dragging the terrified imperial court, including the young Emperor Antoku with them, retreating south and west toward the inland sea, desperately seeking refuge. They were no longer the rulers of Japan. They were refugees clinging to the last vestiges of their lost glory, pursued relentlessly by the roaring storm of the Genji war machine. The stage was now set for the final brutal acts of the Genpei War, where the fate of the imperial line, the samurai code, and the entire structure of Japanese society would be decided on the blood-soaked beaches and unforgiving waves of the final catastrophic battlegrounds.